She threw the train fare back at him. Every coin hit the station platform and scattered across the wood, ringing loud enough that every head in Millhaven, Wyoming, turned to look. Elena Brooks stood with her back straight and her chin high, her travel bag at her feet. Her heart in pieces, she refused to let anyone see. Thomas Greer stared at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want what you promised." He laughed and walked away. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Elena's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The letter had taken 11 days to reach her in St. Louis. Elena had read it 4 times before she believed it was real. A cattle rancher in Millhaven, Wyoming, seeking a wife through a reputable agency, a man named Thomas Greer, who owned 200 acres and ran 300 head of cattle. A man who wrote in a steady, careful hand that he was looking for a woman of sound character and practical mind. He'd included a photograph. He looked solid, responsible. The kind of man who paid his debts and kept his word. She had spent 3 weeks deciding. She was 31 years old, a bookkeeper's daughter who'd buried her father the previous spring and watched her mother's health fail slowly after that. The house in St. Louis was mortgaged. Her options were narrowing. The agency had presented Thomas Greer's profile alongside 5 others, but his letter was the only one that hadn't made her feel like livestock at a county fair. He'd asked about her interests. He'd asked what she liked to read. She'd written back the same day. The correspondence had lasted 2 months. Careful letters, cautious letters. Letters that slowly grew warmer. By the time Thomas Greer sent train fare and a formal offer, Elena had convinced herself she was making a sound decision. Not a romantic one. She was too practical for that, but a sound one. A fresh start. A life with real ground under her feet instead of debt and grief and the shrinking walls of a house that no longer felt like home. She packed everything she owned into 1 trunk and 1 travel bag. She told her mother she was going to build something. She rode the train for 4 days. And then Thomas Greer looked at her across the Millhaven station platform, took in everything about her in under 10 seconds. Her travel-worn dress, her single trunk, the way her hair had come loose from its pins after 1,000 miles of railroad, and handed her back the train fare without saying a single word. "Mr. Greer." Her voice had come out steadier than she'd expected. "I've traveled 1,100 miles. "I can see that," he said. His voice was flat, bored almost. "I'm sorry you made the trip. You corresponded with me for 2 months. "I did." He didn't look sorry. He looked inconvenienced. "Circumstances have changed. There's money enough there to get you back to wherever you came from. I'd take it if I were you." The coins were still in his outstretched hand when she knocked them loose. She hadn't planned it. Her hand moved before her mind caught up a sharp sideways strike that sent every coin spinning off his palm and ringing across the station platform. People stopped. A woman near the ticket window gasped. 2 men by the door to the express office turned to stare. Thomas Greer looked at his empty hand. Then he looked at her. "I don't want your money," Elena said. "I want what you promised." He laughed then, a short dismissive sound, and he walked away. Didn't look back. Didn't offer a single word of explanation beyond what he'd already given. Just turned and walked off the platform like she was a problem he'd already finished thinking about. Elena stood there with her trunk at her feet and every eye in Millhaven, Wyoming on her face. She did not cry. She thought about it. The back of her throat went tight, and her vision blurred for just a moment, the particular kind of blurring that comes just before everything breaks open. But she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and looked out at the main street of this small town she'd never seen before. The general store, the livery, the courthouse with its weather vane turning slow in the November wind, and she made a decision. She was not going home. She had no home to go back to. She reached down and picked up one of the coins from the platform. Then another. The watching townspeople didn't help her. A few of them drifted closer, curiosity overcoming whatever manners they'd been raised with. An older woman in a green dress murmured something to the woman beside her, and Elena heard the word agency and felt the shape of the judgment behind it without needing to hear anything else. She had collected about half the coins when a shadow fell across the platform boards. "You missed one." The voice was low, unhurried. A man's voice, the kind that didn't push itself, didn't need to. Elena looked up. He was standing back from the loose half-circle of onlookers, not quite part of the crowd, and not quite separate from it. Tall, dark-haired, under a worn hat that had seen better years, with the kind of shoulders that came from actual work, and the kind of stillness that came from a man who'd learned not to waste motion. He was holding a coin out toward her, a 10-cent piece that had skipped farther than the others and come to rest near his boot. Elena straightened. "Thank you." He placed the coin in her open palm without ceremony. "You got somewhere to be?" "Not at the moment," she said, which was the truest thing she'd said all day. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way the others were looking at her, not with judgment or gossip or pity dressed up as concern. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's actually trying to solve. "I'm Wyatt Hale," he said. "I run the Double H 6 miles out. I came into town for supplies, and I happened to be standing in the wrong place at the right time." He paused. "Or the right place at the right time, depending on how you want to look at it." "Elena Brooks," she said. "Miss Brooks." He touched the brim of his hat. "You a practical woman?" The question surprised her enough that she almost laughed. "I'd like to think so. I've got 12 ranch hands, no cook, and a house that hasn't had a woman's hand on it in 4 years, he said. "I'm not offering anything permanent. 3 months, room board and fair wages. You'd run the house and the kitchen. Work'd be hard, and the men aren't always polite, but they're not mean. You'd have your own room with a lock on the door." He said it plainly, no performance in it, like he was quoting terms from a contract he'd already thought through. "If at the end of 3 months you want to move on, I'll personally drive you to the station. If you want to stay on, we can talk about what that looks like." Elena looked at him. She looked past him at the main street of Millhaven, at the dwindling crowd of onlookers losing interest now that the drama had resolved itself without further spectacle. She thought about the coins in her hand, and the trunk at her feet, and the 4-day train ride, and her mother's face at the St. Louis station, thin and hopeful, and trying not to look frightened. She thought about Thomas Greer's laugh. "The men," she said. "They know how to behave at a table." Something shifted at the corner of Wyatt Hale's mouth. Not quite a smile. "They know how to behave when they're told to." "And you'll tell them?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I accept," she said. She picked up her travel bag herself. Wyatt Hale reached for her trunk without being asked, lifted it like it weighed nothing, and carried it toward a wagon waiting at the side of the road without fanfare or ceremony, as though they'd agreed to this arrangement long ago and were simply getting on with it. Elena followed him, and she did not look back at the station platform. She would remember that decision later. The decision not to look back as the moment everything in her life changed direction. Not because of Thomas Greer, not because of rejection or humiliation or the particular cruelty of having her hopes handed back to her in a fistful of coins, but because of what she chose to face forward toward. Because sometimes the story doesn't begin with what you lose. Sometimes it begins with what you refuse to lose yourself to. The wagon ride to the Double H took the better part of an hour, and they spent most of it in silence, which suited Elena fine. She'd had enough words for one day. The land opened up around them as they left Millhaven behind the flat grassland, rolling out in every direction. The sky enormous overhead, in the way that western skies always are too big for comfort if you're used to cities. But Elena found herself breathing deeper the farther they got from town. Wyatt drove without effort, handling the horses with the kind of easy competence that told her he'd done this 10,000 times. He didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances or explanations. She appreciated that more than she could have said. About halfway out he spoke. "Greer have a reason." "He didn't offer one," Elena said. Wyatt nodded once, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "He's done this before." Elena turned to look at him. "Pardon. Second time I've seen him turn a woman away at that station," Wyatt said. His voice was level, no editorial in it, just the fact. First time was 2 years ago. Girl from Ohio. She cried the whole way back to the platform. He didn't look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the road. You didn't cry. I was going to, Elena said honestly. I know, he said. Glad you didn't. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she looked out at the grassland again and didn't say anything. The double H came into view just as the afternoon light was going long and golden across the flat ground. It was bigger than she'd expected, a main house in solid timber, a long bunkhouse set back from it, a barn that had been recently repaired on the south side, corrals and fence lines running out in organized intervals. It looked like a working ranch, not a rich man's show property, and there was something reassuring in the purposefulness of it. Every structure had a reason for being exactly where it was. 3 ranch hands were visible when the wagon pulled in. They stopped what they were doing and watched without being obvious about watching, the way men do when they're trying to assess a situation without appearing to. Wyatt set the brake and climbed down. Boys, he said, addressing the 3 without ceremony. This is Miss Elena Brooks. She'll be running the house and the kitchen for the next 3 months. You'll treat her like you'd treat your mother, and if your mother raised you wrong, you'll pretend she didn't. He said it without raising his voice. Understood. Yes, sir, said all 3 almost in unison. Elena stepped down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. Old habit. She looked at the 3 men, steadily letting them look back without flinching or apologizing for taking up space. I'll have supper on by 6, she said. I'll need to know if anyone has something they can't eat. One of the men, young, freckled, the kind of sunburned that suggested he'd never learned to wear a hat properly, raised his hand like a schoolboy. Clyde Marsh, ma'am. I can't do onions. They make me sick, something terrible. Noted, Elena said. No onions for Mr. Marsh. Just Clyde, he said, and looked relieved enough about it that she almost felt sorry for him. Wyatt carried her trunk to the house and showed her the room corner of the second-floor east-facing window, a narrow bed with a quilted cover and a small writing table beside it. The lock on the door was exactly what he'd said it was: solid, functional, and attached. Kitchen's stocked, he said from the doorway. Pantry's through the left door. If there's something you need that isn't there, write it down, and I'll have someone bring it in from town. Thank you, Elena said. He nodded and left without any further ceremony. She stood in the center of the small room with her travel bag in her hand, and her trunk against the wall, and the late afternoon light coming through the east-facing window. And she stood there for a long moment, letting herself feel everything she hadn't let herself feel at the station. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the disorientation of standing in a life that was not the one she'd prepared for. She let herself feel it all. Then she set her bag down, took off her coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, and went downstairs to find the kitchen. She had supper on the table by 5:50. It wasn't much. She'd worked with what was in the pantry, which was enough, but not extravagant salt pork and pan gravy. Cornbread baked in the large iron skillet she found hanging on the kitchen wall. Dried apples stewed down with a little sugar and cinnamon she found at the back of the spice shelf. Plain food, but hot and seasoned properly, and put on the table at the time she'd said it would be there. The ranch hands filed in with the particular awareness of men who aren't sure of the rules yet. They found their seats without being assigned them, which told Elena they'd had a system before, and were sliding back into it by default. She brought the food out and set it without comment, and she sat at the end nearest the kitchen door, rather than at the head of the table, which she filed away as a decision she'd reconsider later once she understood the room better. Wyatt sat at the head. He looked at the table before he looked at her, taking in the food with a quick assessment, and then he looked at her. Miss Brooks, he said, would you say grace? She hadn't expected that. She kept the surprise off her face. I'd be honored, she said. The table went quiet. 12 men and 1 woman in the lamplight heads bowed. Elena folded her hands. She thought of her father who'd said grace every evening of his life. She thought of the station platform and the scattered coins and the long blank sound of Thomas Greer's laugh. She thought of the east-facing window upstairs and the solid lock on the door. "Lord," she said, "thank you for this food and for the hands that work this land. Thank you for open doors when other doors close. And thank you for people who offer a stranger something worth getting back on her feet for." She paused. "Amen." "Amen," said 12 voices. She heard underneath them Wyatt Hale's voice among the others. She didn't look up in time to see his expression. But she noted the fact of it, and she stored it carefully in the part of her mind that collected things worth remembering. The food was eaten quickly and with appetite, which was the only review that mattered in a working kitchen. Clyde Marsh cleaned his plate twice, and then looked at her with the open gratitude of a young man who'd been eating badly for too long. "Best meal I've had since my mama's table, Miss Brooks." "High praise," Elena said. "I'll try to deserve it again tomorrow." A few of the other men laughed. The room loosened a little. Not much. They were still feeling their way around the new arrangement, still figuring out who she was and what her presence would mean for the daily rhythm of their working lives. But enough. After supper, she washed the dishes herself. She'd expected to. She heard the men outside, the sound of boots on the porch and the low rumble of conversation, horses shifting in the corral, the creak of the bunkhouse door. The ordinary sounds of a ranch settling into its evening. She was drying the last pan when Wyatt appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You didn't have to do that tonight," he said. "You've been traveling." "I've been traveling for 4 days," she said. "I'd rather have something to do with my hands." He looked at her for a moment. "How bad was it, the train?" "Long," she said. "But I've done worse." She hung the pan on its hook. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you offer?" she asked. "You didn't know me from anyone. You could have walked past." Wyatt was quiet for the moment. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not in a closed-off way, more like a man thinking something through before he said it. "My mother came out west on an arrangement," he said finally, 30 years ago. Man she was supposed to marry died of fever before she got here. She had nothing and nobody, and the town she arrived in wasn't kind to her." He paused. "A rancher took her on as a cook, kept her on for 2 years while she got her feet back under her. Then he married her." He looked at Elena without apology. "That rancher was my father." Elena held the dish towel in her hands and didn't say anything. "So," Wyatt said, "I reckon I know what it looks like when a woman's been left standing somewhere she wasn't supposed to be left standing." He pushed off the doorframe. "You did good tonight, Miss Brooks. The men'll come around fast if you keep feeding them like that." He was almost to the door when she said, "Your mother, was she happy?" He stopped. Didn't turn around right away. When he did, there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before, something older than his face and quieter. "Yeah," he said. "She was happy." He left. Elena stood in the kitchen of the Double H Ranch with the clean pans on their hooks, and the fire banked low in the stove, and the November wind pressing at the kitchen window. And she thought about a woman she'd never met who'd arrived somewhere unexpected and made something real out of it anyway. She thought that maybe that was enough of a blueprint to work from. She turned off the lamp and went upstairs, and when she lay down on the narrow bed under the quilted cover, she was asleep before she could think another word. Not the sleep of peace, she wasn't there yet, but the sleep of a woman who had made it through the day on her own terms. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She was up before the sun. That was the first thing the men learned about Elena Brooks. She didn't sleep in, didn't ease into mornings, didn't wait for the world to come to her. By the time Clyde Marsh stumbled out of the bunkhouse pulling his suspenders up, there was already smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and the smell of coffee cutting through the cold November air sharp enough to wake a man from 20 yards. He stood there on the bunkhouse step, with his boots half-laced, and stared at the main house like he wasn't sure he was seeing it right. "She's already up," he said to no one in particular. Behind him, a voice from inside the bunkhouse said, "What time is it?" "5:30. A long pause. Lord have mercy. Elena heard none of this. She was already deep in the rhythm of the kitchen, moving between the stove and the long prep table, with the efficiency of a woman who'd been feeding people since she was old enough to reach the counter. Her mother had run a boarding house for 6 years before her health went. Elena had learned to cook for crowds before she'd learned to cook for pleasure. And there was a particular muscle memory in it, the instinct for quantity, for timing, for keeping everything hot at once, that came back to her now like it had never left. She had biscuits in the oven, salt pork sliced, and ready a pot of oats on the back burner, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Wyatt came through the kitchen at 5:40. He stopped when he saw the table already set, the food already taking shape, and he stood there for just a moment with his hat in his hand, and an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to start this early," he said. "Ranch hands work at first light," Elena said without looking up from the biscuits she was pulling from the oven. "If I'm feeding them, I feed them before they work, not after." He was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to cook for numbers like this?" "My mother's boarding house," she said. "St. Louis. 6 years. 22 boarders at peak." She set the biscuits on the rack and finally looked at him. "I'm not new to this, Mr. Hale." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recalibration, the look of a man quietly adjusting an estimate upward. "No," he said slowly. "I can see that." He poured himself a cup of coffee and took it with him out to the barn without another word, which she was beginning to understand was his version of approval. By the time the men filed in for breakfast, the table was full. Not fancy, she wasn't working with a full pantry yet, and she knew better than to overpromise, but substantial and hot and seasoned right. The men sat down with the cautious appreciation of people who'd been eating badly and weren't sure yet if the improvement was going to last. It lasted. By the third morning, they stopped being cautious. By the end of the first week, Clyde Marsh had taken to leaving wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill, which Elena chose to interpret as gratitude, rather than anything more complicated. A ranch hand named Pete Dolan, who was approximately 60 years old and had the weathered permanence of a fence post that had survived too many seasons to bother falling down, started leaving the kitchen wood box full without being asked. A quieter man named Hector Reyes began bringing her eggs from the henhouse every morning before she was even looking for them, setting them on the counter without fanfare, and disappearing before she could thank him. She noticed all of it. She didn't make a production of it. What she made instead was a household that ran. The main house had been in a particular kind of disorder, not filth exactly, but the accumulated disorganization of a place where no one had been keeping track of the whole. Supplies were stored in 3 different places with no system between them. The household accounts hadn't been reconciled in 2 months. There were invoices from the feed supplier tucked under a coffee tin on the kitchen shelf, next to a letter from the county assessor's office that had been opened and then apparently set aside and forgotten. Elena found the letter on her 4th day. She read it twice carefully, and then she set it back where she'd found it and spent the rest of the morning thinking about what it meant. The county was reassessing land values in the district. The letter was informational, not urgent, but the date on it was 6 weeks old, and the reassessment period had a deadline, and the deadline was in 3 weeks. She waited until evening after supper, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, and she and Wyatt were the only 2 left in the main room. He was at the desk in the corner working through what looked like breeding records when she came in and set the letter on the desk in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "Where'd you find this?" "Under the coffee tin in the kitchen," she said, "with 2 feed invoices that are 30 days past due." His jaw tightened. "I've been meaning to get to those." "The assessment deadline is in 3 weeks, Elena said. "If the county reassesses at the new rate without a formal response from you, your property tax obligation goes up by roughly 1/3 based on the current acreage." She paused. "I worked out the numbers this afternoon." Wyatt stared at her. "You worked out the numbers." "I'm a bookkeeper's daughter," she said. "I know how to read an assessment letter." She pulled out the sheet of paper she'd brought with her, her own handwriting, neat columns, the figures laid out clearly. "You need to file a formal response contesting the new valuation. You'll need your original deed documentation and the most recent survey. If you have both, I can draft the response letter tonight." The room was very quiet. "You can do that," Wyatt said. "I've done it twice for my father's clients," Elena said. "It's not complicated if you have the paperwork." He looked at her for a long moment. long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped, if she'd pushed into something that felt like his territory in a way that wasn't welcome. She was a cook. She was hired to run the house and feed 12 men. She hadn't been hired to manage the ranch's legal correspondence. "The deed's in the strongbox," Wyatt said. "Top drawer of the desk. Surveys rolled up behind the bookshelf." Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'll need an hour." "Take 2, he said. "I'll make coffee." She drafted the response letter that night at the kitchen table, with the lamp turned up high and Wyatt's deed and survey spread out beside her. He brought coffee and then stayed not hovering, but present, sitting across the table and reading through the breeding records he'd brought from the desk while she worked. It was the first time she'd shared a room with him in extended silence, and she discovered that he was easy to be in a room with. He didn't fill quiet with noise the way some men didn't need to be the center of the air around him. She found herself working better than she expected to, which she noted and didn't examine too closely. When she set down her pen, he looked up. "Done," she said. He came around the table and read it standing behind her, and she was aware of his proximity in the objective observational way she was aware of most things. She filed it and moved on. He read the whole letter without comment, then read it again, then straightened. "That's good," he said. "That's better than anything I would have put together." "You would have figured it out," Elena said. "Maybe," he said, "but not in time." He looked at her then with an expression that was more unguarded than anything she'd seen from him in a week, and she looked back steadily and waited for him to say whatever he was going to say. "I'd like to pay you extra for this," he said. "It's not what I hired you for." "It is what I'm capable of," Elena said. "We can discuss the arrangement later. Right now, I'd like to go to sleep." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, the way his expression moved, and then held before he turned back to the desk, and she took her lamp and went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a long time that night, not quite able to sleep. Through the east-facing window, the sky was enormous and salt white with stars. The kind of sky that made a person feel very small and very awake at the same time. She thought about the letter she'd drafted. She thought about his face when he'd read it. She thought more carefully than she wanted to, about the fact that she was becoming useful here in ways she hadn't anticipated, and that being useful felt different than it used to, less like an obligation, and more like something that belonged to her. She pressed that thought flat and went to sleep. The second week brought cold that arrived overnight and stayed. The men worked harder in the cold. There was always more to do when the temperature dropped more, to protect more, to check more, to reinforce. And they came in for meals, hungrier and quieter, and more grateful in the wordless way of exhausted people. Elena fed them and learned them. She learned that Pete Dolan's hands had been broken twice and ached in cold weather, and she started leaving the coffee on the stove an extra hour in the mornings without saying why. She learned that a young hand named Jesse Carr was sending half his wages home to a mother in Kansas and ate like he was trying to take in enough calories to last the week, and she began making sure his portions were larger without making it conspicuous. She learned that Hector Reyes said the blessing under his breath in Spanish before every meal, and that Wyatt Hale noticed and never commented, which she added to the accumulating evidence of who he was. Wyatt himself remained consistent in the way that only men with real structure to them manage, not rigid, not closed, but deeply settled. He started each morning early and ended it late, and moved through the hours between with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who knew exactly what needed doing and trusted himself to do it. He stopped by the kitchen most evenings now, not always with a reason, sometimes just for a second cup of coffee and a few words about the day's work. She found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the kitchen floor. She told herself it was because she was attuned to the sounds of the house. She was becoming its keeper, its central nervous system. It made sense that she would track movement through it. She told herself this with some conviction for about 4 more days. Then Millhaven arrived at her door. It was a Wednesday morning, cold and bright, and she was hanging the week's wash on the line behind the house when she heard the wagon coming up the ranch road. She recognized the woman in the front seat, Clara Hutchins' wife of the town's dry goods merchant, who had been one of the women standing near the ticket window at the station the day Elena arrived. The woman who'd said the word agency like it had a taste she didn't care for. Clara climbed down from the wagon with the particular dignity of a woman who had decided on her position before she arrived. She was accompanied by another woman Elena didn't recognize, smaller and younger, who looked like she'd been brought along as a witness. "Miss Brooks," Clara said. "I hope we're not intruding." "You are a little," Elena said pleasantly, "but come in if you'd like." Clara blinked. She'd clearly expected either deference or defensiveness, and plain honesty had caught her off guard. She recovered quickly. "We wanted to call. It seemed right given your situation." Elena picked up her laundry basket and walked toward the kitchen door. "Come in then. Coffee's still hot." She didn't wait to see if they followed. They did. In the kitchen she poured 3 cups and set them on the table and sat down, and she looked at Clara Hutchins with the calm, direct attention of a woman who knew exactly what kind of call this was. "You're managing well," Clara said, looking around the kitchen with an assessment she didn't bother to hide. "Better than I expected, honestly. Better than you expected when you expected me to be on the next train back to St. Louis," Elena said. Clara had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "We weren't sure what you'd do." "I stayed," Elena said. "Yes." Clara set her cup down. "People have noticed. Wyatt Hale's ranch is running better than it has in years from what I hear. The men are talking in town." She paused. "Thomas Greer has noticed too." Elena kept her expression perfectly even. "Has he?" "He was asking questions," Clara said, lowering her voice like the kitchen walls might carry it. "About the arrangement, about whether it was appropriate. Whether a woman working as a housekeeper on a cattle ranch is appropriate," Elena said. "Whether the nature of the arrangement was entirely professional," Clara said. And there it was, the real thing finally surfacing. Elena picked up her coffee cup. She took a sip. She set it down. She looked at Clara Hutchins with the steady patience of a woman who has decided not to be moved by small people and their small thoughts. "Mrs. Hutchins," she said, "I draft legal correspondence for Mr. Hale's county assessments. I manage household accounts that hadn't been reconciled in 2 months. I feed 12 working men 3 meals a day, and I haven't asked anyone for anything I haven't earned." She paused. "Is there something about that arrangement you find inappropriate?" Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. "Thomas Greer," Elena continued in the same even tone, "rejected a legally contracted arrangement in a public place and offered me train fare like I was a problem to be tidied away. Whatever questions he's asking now, they're not about propriety." The younger woman made a small sound that might have been a laugh and covered it with her coffee cup. Clara stood. "I meant no offense, Miss Brooks." "I know," Elena said. "That's almost the more interesting part." She showed them out with courtesy and no warmth, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the wagon until it turned back onto the main road. Then she went back to her laundry. She was 3/4 through hanging the last load when she realized Wyatt was standing at the corner of the house. She didn't know how long he'd been there. From the look on his face, long enough. "You heard," she said. "Some of it," he said. "Enough." She picked up a shirt from the basket and pinned it to the line. "Greer's asking questions." "I know what Greer's doing," Wyatt said. His voice was quiet and very even in the way it got when he was holding something in check. "He does it every time. Sends someone to sniff around. Make people uncomfortable wait for them to leave on their own, so he doesn't have to do anything directly." Elena stopped with her hands on the line. "Why does he care what goes on at your ranch?" The pause was just a half-second too long. "That's a longer conversation," Wyatt said. "Then we'll have it at supper," Elena said. He looked at her. She looked back. She had a clothespin in her hand, and her hair had come loose again, and there were clouds moving in from the northwest, and she stood there in all of it without blinking. "Yeah," Wyatt said quietly. "I reckon we will." He walked back toward the barn, and Elena pinned the last shirt to the line, and the wind picked up from the northwest, carrying the first cold teeth of a real winter storm, and she stood for a moment with the empty laundry basket on her hip and thought about what a longer conversation meant and what it might cost her to have it. She thought she was ready. She thought that right up until the first snow began to fall, soft and fast and serious, and somewhere in the barn a horse cried out with a sound that brought every man on the Double H to his feet. The sound a horse makes when it's dying is not something a person forgets. It isn't loud exactly. It's the opposite of loud. A low, strained groaning that comes from somewhere deep in the animal. Something that sounds almost like effort, like the horse is working against something inside itself that it cannot fight and cannot name. Elena had heard it once before when she was 12 years old, and her father's rented mare had colicked in the middle of a January night, and she had stood in the barn doorway in her nightgown and watched the horse go down and not come back up. She dropped the laundry basket before she knew she was moving. The barn door was already open when she got there. Wyatt had come from the other direction faster, and 3 of the men were already inside. The mare, a bay named Rosie, that Pete Dolan had mentioned twice at supper with the particular tenderness of a man who didn't say much about things he cared for, was down on her side in the stall, her legs moving in the slow cycling way that meant pain and confusion, and the body trying to find a position that didn't hurt. "Get her up," Wyatt said. His voice was sharp. "She stays down, we lose her." "She won't stand," Clyde said. He was already in the stall, his hands on the mare's neck, and his voice had the high controlled edge of someone trying not to panic. "She went down twice already. I can't get her to—" "Her gut sounds," Elena said. Everyone looked at her. She was already moving into the stall, crouching beside the mare's midsection, pressing her ear to the animal's side. She'd learned this from her father's veterinarian, a German man named Brower, who'd let her follow him on calls if she stayed quiet and out of the way. "You listen to the gut," he'd told her. "No sounds, it's bad. Wrong sounds, it's worse. Gut tells you everything." She listened. "Left side," she said, standing. "There's gas. She's not impacted. I can hear movement on the right. It's displacement colic, not obstruction." Wyatt stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I know the difference between a quiet gut and a noisy one," she said. "And right now hers is making noise on the wrong side." She looked at him directly. "She needs to move. Walk her, not fast, not forced, just moving. Keep her from rolling. If she rolls with the gas displacement, the gut can twist, and then she's gone." She paused. "Do you have oil mineral or linseed?" "Tack room," Wyatt said. He hadn't moved. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not doubt, not skepticism, something closer to the feeling of ground shifting under you and finding it solid anyway. "Get it," she said. "Quarter cup in warm water tubed if you have the equipment. If not, we try to get it in her another way." She was already pulling the stall latch open. "But first she walks. Who's the calmest with her?" "Pete." 3 voices said simultaneously. Pete Dolan was already shouldering past the others into the stall. He didn't say a word. He put his big, broken-knuckled hand on Rosie's neck and spoke to her in a low sound that wasn't quite words, and the mare's ears moved toward him. Elena watched the horse's focus shift the blind inward-turned suffering, loosening just a fraction toward the sound of a voice she knew. "Good," Elena said quietly. "Keep doing that. We need her standing." It took 6 minutes to get Rosie on her feet. Pete talked the whole time low and steady, while Wyatt and Clyde supported the mare's weight on either side, and Elena watched her breathing, watching for the signs that would tell her the colic was worsening or holding. The snow was still falling outside. She could hear it against the barn roof, and the lamplight in the barn was gold and close and smelled of hay and horse and cold air coming under the door. Hector Reyes appeared at her elbow. "I found the mineral oil," he said, "and the tubing's in the far cabinet." "Thank you," she said. "Do you know how to use it?" "No, ma'am." "I do," said a voice from the barn entrance. She turned. Wyatt was already there pulling on his work coat, and the expression on his face had settled into the particular focused calm of a man who knows what he has to do and is doing it. "My father taught me," he said, "before he died." He took the oil and the tubing from Hector without looking at Elena. "You keep reading her. Tell me if anything changes." "Understood," she said. What followed was 40 minutes of close, quiet, intensely concentrated work. Elena watched Rosie's breathing and gut sounds while Pete walked her in slow circles, and Wyatt administered the oil with a steadiness and competence that she watched with a respect she didn't put into words. The other men stationed themselves around the barn's periphery, not in the way, but present, because this was the kind of moment when a working outfit pulls together without being asked, when every man in the building has something to lose if the thing goes wrong. At the 20-minute mark, Rosie's gut sounds shifted. Elena heard it and felt something release in her own chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "She's moving through it," she said. Pete said something very soft to the mare that might have been "thank God." At 40 minutes, Rosie stopped resisting Pete's lead and walked with him instead of against him, and her breathing steadied and the cycling leg movement that meant pain began to ease. By the time an hour had passed from the moment Elena dropped the laundry basket, the mare was standing at her hay net and eating carefully, like a patient who isn't sure she deserves the recovery yet, but is willing to accept it. The men drifted out slowly, ones and twos, back to the work the storm had interrupted. Clyde squeezed Elena's arm as he passed, just once brief, the impulsive gratitude of a young man who didn't have more words than that. Hector nodded at her in the particular way that carries everything. Pete stayed with Rosie, which everyone understood and nobody questioned. Wyatt stayed too. When the barn was quiet, just the three of them and the mare and the snow against the roof, he turned to look at Elena. She was leaning against the stall door, more tired than she'd expected to be. The focus that had carried her through the last hour was letting go of her all at once, and she felt the cold and the exertion and the thing that lived underneath both of them, which was the particular fragility of caring about an outcome. "Where did you learn that?" Wyatt asked. "A veterinarian named Brower," she said. "My father used to let me follow him on his calls. I was 11, 12 years old. He didn't mind if I kept quiet." "You weren't quiet tonight?" "No," she said. "I wasn't." He was looking at her in a way she'd been aware of for 2 weeks and had been carefully not examining the way you don't look directly at something bright, because you know what, looking directly at it will cost you. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About Greer," she said. The name landed between them in the quiet barn and sat there. "Yeah," he said. He pushed off the wall he'd been leaning against and stood straight the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been carrying. "About Greer, and about this ranch, and about why his questions aren't about you. Tell me." "The Double H sits on the western edge of the best water access in this county," Wyatt said. "2 creeks run through the north pasture. In a dry year, and this country gets dry years, that water access is worth more than the cattle, more than the acreage, more than anything. Thomas Greer has been trying to acquire this land for 4 years. Elena straightened slightly. "Acquire? He made me an offer twice. I turned him down twice. He's tried 3 other approaches since then. County pressure boundary. Disputes a manufactured debt claim I had to fight in front of the judge last spring." Wyatt's voice was level, but underneath the level she could hear what it had cost him to fight all of it. "He doesn't come at things directly. He applies pressure until people give up or make mistakes. He runs out women who work for me because having someone manage the house accounts means someone might notice things he doesn't want noticed." Elena was very still. "What things?" "The feed invoices that were 30 days past due," Wyatt said. "I didn't forget those. The supplier is a man named Carter who does business with Greer. He's been manipulating delivery quantities, charging me for weight I'm not receiving. It's not enough in any single transaction to fight in court, but over 2 years it adds up." He paused. "I noticed it 6 months ago. I've been documenting it, but I don't have anyone who can pull the records together in a way that would hold up as evidence." Elena looked at him. In the lamplight of the barn with the snow falling outside, she understood the full shape of what he was telling her. Not just the water rights, not just the invoices. The whole architecture of it, the slow, patient pressure of a man who had enough money and enough connections to grind people down without ever raising his voice. The reason Thomas Greer had sought a mail-order bride and then publicly rejected her. The reason Clara Hutchins had been sent to sniff around the propriety of the arrangement. The reason the county assessment letter had been quietly buried under a coffee tin. Greer wasn't asking questions about Elena because of propriety. He was asking questions about Elena because Elena was a bookkeeper's daughter who could read an assessment letter and reconcile 2 months of household accounts in an afternoon. He had seen from the moment Wyatt brought her home exactly what she represented. "He's been trying to isolate you," she said. Wyatt held her gaze. "Yes." "And the invoices from Carter, you have them all?" "Every one. Going back 2 years. "I'll need them," Elena said. "All of them. And I'll need your records of actual delivery quantities if you kept them." "I kept them," Wyatt said. And then very quietly, "I was hoping you'd say that." The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. She heard what he wasn't saying, the particular difficulty of a man who is good at doing things alone, having to admit that he needs someone, the relief of finally having someone to admit it to. She pushed off the stall door. "I'll start tomorrow. Tonight we both need to sleep." She paused. "Pete's going to stay with Rosie." "I know," Wyatt said. "He always does." They walked out of the barn together into the snow, which had settled into a quiet and steady fall, the kind that doesn't announce itself but means business. The main house was warm lit across the yard. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, someone was playing a mouth harp badly and without embarrassment. At the kitchen door, Elena stopped. "Why didn't you tell me about Greer earlier?" she asked. Wyatt thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, the honest consideration of a man who doesn't answer questions he hasn't thought through. "Because I wasn't sure you were staying," he said. She turned and looked at him fully. The snow was settling in his hair and on the shoulders of his work coat, and he was looking at her with something he was no longer working as hard to keep off his face. "I'm staying," she said. He nodded once. "I know that now." She went inside. She stood in the kitchen in her coat for a full minute before she took it off, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she rarely was. The way it happened when you've arrived at the edge of something and looked over and found the drop longer than you expected, but the ground below solid. She put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table. She pulled a sheet of paper from the writing box she'd moved to the kitchen shelf in her second week, and she began making notes, column headings, data points the shape of what she was going to need to build if this was going to hold up to scrutiny. She worked until midnight. Wyatt came back through the kitchen at 9 to tell her Pete had reported Rosie was stable and eating well, and he stopped when he saw her at the table with the papers spread out and the lamp turned up. "You're already starting," he said. "I made a list of what I'll need," she said. "I'll need you to sit down with me tomorrow and go through the delivery records. This only works if the documentation is complete." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, which she noted as a change. 2 weeks ago he'd stood in doorways. Now he sat at tables. She filed it without comment. "You should know something," he said. She looked up from her notes. "That letter from the county assessor," he said. "The response you drafted, I sent it in the morning after you wrote it." He paused. "Got a reply today. They're accepting the contested valuation. The tax rate holds at the current level." Elena set her pen down. She had spent 11 days on the Double H. She had fed 12 men 3 times a day, reconciled 2 months of accounts, identified a fraudulent supplier scheme, nursed a horse through a colic emergency, and successfully filed a county tax contestation. All of this on a 3-month contract that had begun as a stranger's act of kindness at a train station. "Good?" she said. "Good," Wyatt agreed. And then after a pause, "Elena." It was the first time he'd used her name, not Miss Brooks, not ma'am. Her name said plain and careful, like something he'd been holding for a while and was only now setting down. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He just looked back at her across the kitchen table, with the papers between them and the lamp burning low and the snow still falling outside. And she understood that some things get said without words and mean more for it. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got work to do tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said. and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it had that first morning in the kitchen, the almost smile that she had decided somewhere in the last 11 days was one of her favorite things about the way his face worked. He stood and took his coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it. She noticed that he'd started doing that in the last week, a small adjustment he'd made without her asking, and walked out of the kitchen. Elena sat alone at the table for a moment, her pen in her hand, and the notes in front of her, and the warm kitchen around her, and she thought about a man who used her first name like it was something to be careful with. She thought about a horse who had made it through. She thought about a longer conversation that had finally been had, and what it had cost them both to have it, and what it meant that they'd had it anyway. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Because Thomas Greer was still out there patient and systematic, and convinced that the Double H would come to him eventually, and Elena Brooks had spent the last 2 weeks quietly becoming the reason it never would. She was only just getting started. She found the first discrepancy on a Tuesday. It was buried in a delivery manifest from 14 months ago, a hay shipment logged at 400 bales by Carter's Supply Company, cross-referenced against Wyatt's own count, recorded in a worn leather notebook she'd found in the bottom drawer of the desk. His count said 360, 40 bales short. The difference in payment was small enough to argue as a clerical error in any single transaction. Elena didn't believe in clerical errors that always ran in the same direction. She pulled every manifest going back 2 years and started over. By Thursday morning, she had found 11 separate shortfalls across feed grain and fencing supply deliveries. Not one of them was large enough to fight in isolation. Together, they added up to $214 over 26 months, a sum that represented nearly 3 months of ranch operating costs, extracted quietly and consistently from a man who was too busy running 400 acres to count every bale himself. She brought the completed ledger to Wyatt at breakfast. He read through it, standing at the kitchen counter, still in his work coat, coffee going cold beside him. She watched his face while he read, watched the stillness in it that meant he was holding something in check. He set the ledger down. $214. That's what I can prove, Elena said. There may be more in the periods before the records I have. Carter's been supplying this ranch for 8 years, Wyatt said. I know. My father trusted him. I know that too, Elena said, and kept her voice even because she understood what it meant to discover that someone your family trusted had been stealing from you. She'd seen her father's face when a client's bookkeeper turned out to have been skimming for 3 years. It wasn't just the money. It was the particular wound of misplaced trust, the way it made you question your own judgment about people. Wyatt, this is documented. It's provable. That's what matters now. He picked up his coffee, set it back down without drinking. Carter's Greer's man. Yes. So Greer knows every delivery that's gone short. He's been watching the numbers, waiting to see how long before I noticed. He looked up from the ledger. He was counting on me not having anyone who could read this. He miscalculated, Elena said. Something settled in Wyatt's expression. Not satisfaction, something quieter and more durable than that. What do we do with it? We take it to the county sheriff first, Elena said. Not Greer's circuit judge. Sheriff Briggs handles civil fraud at this level before it escalates to the district court. I've drafted a formal complaint. It's on the table. She nodded toward the kitchen table, where 2 sheets of close-written paper sat beside the salt cellar. I'd like you to read it before I make a clean copy. He read it. He read it twice, the same way he'd read the tax assessment response carefully, without rushing, giving it the attention it deserved. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her in the way that had become familiar to her over 3 weeks, the look of a man who keeps recalibrating and keeps finding the new calibration insufficient. You wrote this last night, he said. After you went to sleep, she said. Elena. He stopped, seemed to decide something. You've been working 18-hour days since you got here. The work needed doing. That's not what I said. His voice was quieter now, the particular quiet that meant he was saying the real thing. I said you've been working 18-hour days. I'm saying I see it. I want you to know I see it. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and the draft complaint beside the salt cellar, and 12 sleeping men in the bunkhouse outside, and she felt the particular warmth of being witnessed by someone whose witness meant something. "Then let's make sure it counts for something," she said. They rode into Mill Haven that afternoon, just the two of them. Elena had the complaint in her coat pocket and the full ledger in a satchel she kept on her lap. Wyatt drove, and the road was frozen hard, and the sky was the white-gray of a sky that can't decide whether it's done snowing, and they didn't talk much on the way in, but the silence between them had changed quality over the past weeks. It wasn't the cautious quiet of two strangers gauging each other anymore. It was the comfortable quiet of people who knew each other well enough not to need to fill every moment. She noticed the change. She let herself notice it. Sheriff Briggs was a compact, deliberate man in his mid-50s who listened to everything without interrupting and asked 3 precise questions at the end. He read the complaint. He read through the ledger summary Elena had prepared. He looked up at Wyatt. "This is clean work," he said. "Whoever put this together knows what they're doing." "Miss Brooks," Wyatt said without hesitation. Briggs looked at Elena. "You do this professionally." "My father was a bookkeeper," she said. "I worked with him for 6 years." "She's managing the ranch accounts," Wyatt said, "and doing it better than I ever did." She absorbed that without showing what it did to her. Filed it in the part of her mind she was becoming less disciplined about keeping organized. Briggs accepted the complaint and told them he'd be paying a visit to Carter's supply operation by the end of the week. He also told them, in the particular carefully worded way of a law enforcement officer who is telling you something without telling you something, that Carter's accounts were not the first irregularity that had been traced back to businesses with connections to Thomas Greer. "Is that so?" Wyatt said. "That is so," Briggs said. "You're not the first rancher to sit in that chair, Hale. You might be the first one to come in with documentation this solid." He looked at Elena again. "That makes a difference." They were halfway back to the wagon when the trouble found them. Thomas Greer was coming out of the bank. He saw them at the same moment they saw him. He was with 2 men Elena didn't recognize, dressed better than anyone in Mill Haven had practical reason to be dressed, and he stopped on the bank steps and looked at them with the particular expression of a man recalculating odds. His eyes moved from Wyatt to Elena. They stayed on Elena. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Still here, I see." "Still here," she said pleasantly. "Interesting arrangement you found yourself in." He came down the steps at an easy pace, hands in his coat pockets, the careful body language of a man who wants to look relaxed and is mostly succeeding. "I hope Hale's treating you fairly, given your situation." "My situation?" Elena said. "Arriving the way you did," Greer said. "Without a proper engagement, without protection." He paused with the timing of a man who has practiced his pauses. "Some people in town have questions about the nature of the arrangement." "Some people in town," Wyatt said, "need to find a better use for their time." Greer's attention shifted to Wyatt and sharpened. "I hear you've been having supply problems, Hale. Shame. If you ever find yourself in a position where the ranch becomes difficult to maintain, my offer still stands." "Does it?" Wyatt said. "It's a generous offer." "I'll keep that in mind," Wyatt said, "while I'm filing the fraud complaint with Sheriff Briggs." The pause that followed was brief. Greer's expression didn't change, which told Elena everything it didn't change because he was controlling it, which meant the words had landed somewhere. "Fraud complaint," Greer said. "Against Carter's Supply Company," Elena said. 26 months of documented shortfalls across 11 delivery categories. $214 in provable losses. She kept her voice informational, the tone of a woman reciting figures she has memorized. Sheriff Briggs found the documentation very thorough. Greer looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them blinked. "I see," he said finally. "We should get back," Elena said to Wyatt. "Pete will want the afternoon report on Rosie." They walked past Thomas Greer without another word, and Elena kept her pace even, and her shoulders square, and her face forward, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of that confrontation until they were in the wagon and moving back out onto the frozen road, and then she let out a breath that had been waiting in her chest for about 4 minutes. Wyatt said nothing for a quarter mile. Then, "You knew he'd be at the bank." "I didn't know," Elena said, "but I thought it was possible. He does his business on Tuesday afternoons." Clara Hutchins mentioned it without meaning to when she came to call. She paused. "I thought if he heard about the complaint directly from us, he'd understand that the documentation existed and was already with Briggs. It's harder to make things disappear after that." Wyatt was quiet for another stretch of road. "You planned for him to see us coming out of the sheriff's office." "I planned for the possibility," Elena said. He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. She could feel his gaze on the side of her face with the particular weight it had taken on over the past week, something that had shifted from assessment into something she didn't have a clean word for. "Elena," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say." She finally turned and looked at him. "And I'm not ready to talk about it while I'm still thinking about Greer." A long pause. "Fair enough," he said. They rode the rest of the way home in the changed quiet, which was not the comfortable quiet of earlier, but a more charged one. The quiet of two people who have agreed to wait for a conversation they both know is coming. The waiting lasted exactly 4 days. On Saturday morning, Elena received a letter. It was from her mother's attorney in St. Louis, formal and brief, informing her that the estate of her late father, the small property he'd owned outright separate from the mortgaged house, had finally cleared probate. The value after legal costs was $800. The money was hers. The attorney required her instructions on disbursement. She sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. $800 was not a fortune. But it was real money, more than she'd had at any point in her adult life, more than the train fare that had brought her to Wyoming, more than 3 months of wages. It was the kind of money that changed options. She could pay her way back to St. Louis. She could settle somewhere new. She could live carefully for a year while she found her footing. She could do a great many things that had nothing to do with a cattle ranch in Wyoming. She was still sitting with the letter when Clyde Marsh came into the kitchen for the coffee pot and found her at the table with the expression of someone in the middle of a serious conversation with herself. "You all right, Miss Brooks?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Just reading." He poured his coffee and hesitated, which was unusual for Clyde, who was not generally a man who hesitated. "Can I say something?" She looked up. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, looking at it rather than at her. "I know it ain't my business, but this ranch it wasn't good before you came. Not the work was always good, but the feel of it." He searched for the word. "It was just men doing a job and going to sleep. Now it feels like somewhere." He looked up. "That's you. I just wanted to say that." He left before she could respond. She sat with both the letter and what Clyde had said, and she thought about her father's $800, and she thought about the east-facing window upstairs, and she thought about Wyatt Hale's face when he'd said her name at the kitchen table, plain and careful, like something he'd been holding for a while. She was still sitting there when Wyatt came in at noon. He looked at her and at the letter on the table, and read the room with the efficiency of a man who pays attention. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. He waited. "My father's estate cleared probate," she said. $800. He nodded slowly. "That's your freedom money," he said. "Excuse me, that's what my mother called it," he said. "When a woman has enough put by that she doesn't have to stay anywhere she doesn't want to stay. She called it freedom money." He held his cup in both hands. "She always said every woman should have some." Elena looked at him. "You're not going to ask me to stay?" "No," he said. "That's your decision. It should be free of any pressure from me." He met her eyes directly. "But I want you to know that if you stayed, it wouldn't be as a housekeeper." The kitchen was very quiet. "What would it be as?" she said. "As a partner," he said. "In the ranch, in all of it." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I'm not good at this, Elena. I can tell you the yield on every acre I own, and the temperament of every horse in that barn, but I am not good at saying the things that—" He stopped again. "I don't want you to leave. I'm not asking you to stay. I'm telling you that whatever you decide, I want you to know you changed something here that I didn't know needed changing, and I won't forget it." Elena folded the letter from the attorney and set it on the table between them. "I'm going to write back to the attorney," she said. "I'm going to ask him to hold the funds for 30 days while I consider my options." Wyatt nodded once. His expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders did something that she had learned to read over 4 weeks as his version of relief. 30 days, he said. "I have things to finish first," she said. "The Carter complaint. The account reconciliation for the year-end. Rosie still needs monitoring through the cold." She paused. "And I think Greer isn't done." "He's not," Wyatt said. "Briggs told me he expects pushback. Greer has a lawyer coming up from Cheyenne." "Good," Elena said. "Let him bring a lawyer. I have the ledger," said Détier. She picked up the letter, and went to the desk in the corner. She pulled out the writing paper and began composing her reply to the attorney. Behind her, she heard Wyatt push back his chair, heard him set his cup in the sink, heard him move toward the door. He stopped in the doorway. "Elena." She looked up. He was looking at her, the way he'd been looking at her for 2 weeks, with the thing he'd stopped trying to hide, and in the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, it was completely unguarded. Nothing managed about it, just the plain fact of it. "Thank you," he said, "for staying this long." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Greer's lawyer gets here Friday." The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said quietly. "I'm thanking you for now." He left. Elena looked at the doorway for a moment after he was gone. Then she turned back to her letter, and she wrote it with a steady hand, and she did not let herself think too carefully about what 30 days might become, because some things are better approached, like a ranch in November, one day at a time, with your coat on and your eyes open, trusting the ground under your feet to hold. Outside, the wind had dropped. The cold had settled into the kind of clean, still cold that meant clear skies were coming. Somewhere in the barn, Rosie moved in her stall with the solid, untroubled sound of a horse that had come through something hard and come out the other side of it. Elena sealed her letter. She set it on the corner of the desk where the outgoing mail went, and then Thomas Greer's lawyer arrived 2 days early and everything changed. The lawyer's name was Harlan Voss, and he arrived on a Thursday morning in a hired buggy with a leather briefcase and the particular confidence of a man who had never lost a case he considered important. He came to the ranch directly, not to the sheriff's office, not to the courthouse. He came to the Double H, which told Elena everything she needed to know about his strategy before he opened his mouth. Wyatt was out in the north pasture when the buggy came up the road. Elena was at the kitchen table with the year-end accounts spread in front of her when she heard the wheels on the frozen ground. She looked out the window, saw the buggy, saw the man climbing down from it with his briefcase, and made a decision in about 4 seconds. She put the kettle on and went to the front door. Voss was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, well-dressed with sharp eyes that assessed the house, and then her with the same quick professional sweep. He had the kind of face that was pleasant on the surface and calculating underneath, and Elena recognized the type because she'd sat across the table from similar men in her father's office and watched her father handle them. "Miss Brooks," he said. He hadn't introduced himself yet, which meant he'd been briefed. "Mr. Voss," she said. "I've put the kettle on. Come in." He blinked. He'd expected something else, nerves perhaps, or a ranch hand fetching the owner, or the general disorganization of a household that didn't know it was being visited. He recovered quickly and followed her inside. She sat him at the kitchen table and poured coffee, and sat across from him with her hands folded and her expression pleasant and attentive, and she waited. He opened his briefcase. "I represent Thomas Greer in a matter relating to an outstanding debt claim against the Double H Ranch." "What debt claim?" Elena said. Mr. Greer extended a private loan to the late Robert Hale, Wyatt Hale's father, in the amount of $1,200 in the spring of 1871. He produced a document and slid it across the table. The debt was never repaid and was never formally discharged. Under Wyoming territorial law, the outstanding obligation transfers with the property. Elena looked at the document. She did not pick it up. "May I?" she said, and her voice was perfectly calm. Of course. She picked it up and read it. She read it the way her father had taught her to read documents, not for the words, but for the structure, the dates, the signatures, the notarization. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "When did Mr. Greer's office prepare this document?" she said. Voss smiled with professional patience. "The loan agreement dates to 1871, as I said." "The loan agreement," Elena said. "Yes, but the notarization stamp at the bottom is from the Cheyenne office of a notary named R.C. Drummond." She paused. R.C. Drummond was appointed to the Cheyenne Notary Commission in 1874. She tapped the bottom of the page. 3 years after the date of this alleged loan. The kitchen was completely silent. Voss's pleasant expression did not move. But something behind his eyes shifted the microscopic adjustment of a man who has just discovered that the room is not what he thought it was. "Document dating irregularities can have innocent explanations," he said carefully. "They can," Elena agreed, "and a judge will be very interested in hearing them." She folded her hands again. "Mr. Voss, I have been reconciling the accounts of this ranch for 4 weeks. I have 2 years of delivery manifests, cross-referenced against independent quantity logs, documenting $214 in fraudulent shortfalls by a supplier with documented ties to Thomas Greer. That complaint is already filed with Sheriff Briggs and has been for 6 days. She paused. "And now you've arrived 2 days ahead of schedule with a notarized debt instrument that was notarized by someone who didn't hold a notary commission on the date the document claims." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm a bookkeeper's daughter, Mr. Voss. I've been reading documents since I was 11 years old. You came to the wrong house." Voss was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the document on the table between them. He looked at Elena. "Who are you?" he said, and for the first time the professional pleasantness was entirely gone, replaced by something more genuine, not hostility, but a kind of surprised reassessment. "I'm the woman Thomas Greer tried to send home from the train station 5 weeks ago," Elena said. "He miscalculated." The kitchen door opened. Wyatt came in still in his work coat, and he took in the scene at the table, the open briefcase, the document, Elena's expression with the quick comprehension of a man who had learned to read rooms. "Mr. Voss," he said without particular heat. "Mr. Hale." Voss stood. He picked up the document and put it back in his briefcase with the careful movements of a man buying time. "I think there may be some issues with the documentation that require review before we proceed." "I think that's wise," Wyatt said. Voss closed the briefcase. He looked at Elena one more time, and she held his gaze steadily until he looked away. "Good day, Miss Brooks," he said. "Good day," she said. They listened to the buggy leave. Wyatt stood in the kitchen doorway until the sound of the wheels faded, and then he turned and looked at her across the room. "The notarization," he said. 3 years off," she said. "It's a forged instrument. Greer had it prepared for exactly this situation. If the fraud complaint moved forward, he'd counter with a debt claim that would cloud the ranch's title and make the property legally complicated to defend." She picked up her coffee cup. "But whoever prepared it wasn't careful enough about the notary's appointment date." Wyatt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put both his hands flat on the table and looked at her with something that was past admiration, past gratitude in territory she didn't have a clean word for yet. "Elena," he said. "We need to get the forged document to Briggs today," she said. "Before Voss gets back to Cheyenne and Greer has time to manage the situation. Document fraud is a criminal matter, not a civil one. It changes the nature of the complaint entirely." "I know," he said. "We'll ride in this afternoon." He paused. "But that's not what I'm trying to say." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the full, unguarded weight of everything he'd been holding for 5 weeks, and there was nothing managed about it now, nothing measured or careful or contained. Just Wyatt Hale across the kitchen table in his work coat, with his hands flat on the wood, looking at her like she was the most real thing in the room. "The 30 days," he said. "Yes, I'm not going to wait 30 days to ask," he said. "I told myself I would. I told myself you needed the time and the space and the freedom like my mother said. And I meant all of that. But I just watched you dismantle a man's legal strategy over a cup of coffee before I even got my coat off, and I—" He stopped. His jaw moved. "I'm asking now. Stay. Not because of the ranch. Not because of the accounts or the fraud complaint, or because I need someone who can read a notary stamp. Stay, because this is where you belong, and I think you know it." He paused. "I think you've known it for a while." The kitchen was quiet enough that she could hear the wind against the west wall and Pete Dolan talking to Rosie through the barn wall and the tick of the stove settling. She had been alone in St. Louis when the letter from the agency arrived. She had been alone on the train for 4 days. She had been alone on the station platform with the scattered coins at her feet and Thomas Greer's laugh still in the air, and she had looked out at the main street of Millhaven, Wyoming, and made a decision that she understood now had not been about refusing to go home. It had been about recognizing, in some wordless and immediate way, that she was already there. "I know," she said quietly. Wyatt went very still. "I've known for about 3 weeks," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it." She looked at him directly. "I'm ready now." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not pulling, not grasping, just covering the way you cover something you want to keep from the cold. His hand was calloused and warm and certain, and she turned her palm up and held it. They sat like that for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need anything added to it. Then Elena said, "We still need to ride to Briggs this afternoon." "I know," Wyatt said. He didn't move his hand. "And I want to write a full summary of the notarization discrepancy before we go, for the record." "All right. And I'll need to write to my father's attorney and tell him to close the estate account differently than I'd planned." Wyatt's hand tightened slightly over hers. Not a grip, a question. "I want to put it toward the ranch," she said. "Properly. Legally. I want a stake documented and recorded. Not charity, not a loan, a partnership interest in the Double H." She looked at him. "If that's agreeable." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want it in writing." "I want everything in writing," she said. "I'm a bookkeeper's daughter." This time he did smile. Not the almost smile she'd been collecting since the first morning, the real one, the one that changed his whole face, the one she'd been waiting 5 weeks to see in full. "Yeah," he said. "You are." They rode to Millhaven that afternoon, the two of them side by side on the frozen road, with the sky clear and wide above them, and the winter sun already angling low toward the western ridgeline. Elena had the forged document in the satchel, and a 4-page summary of the notarization discrepancy, in clean, precise handwriting, cross-referenced against the Wyoming Territorial Notary Commission's appointment records she had looked up in the law reference Wyatt kept on the bookshelf. Sheriff Briggs read the summary without speaking. He held the forged instrument up to the window light and examined the notary stamp. He set it down. "Document fraud," he said. "In support of a fraudulent debt claim against a titled property," Elena said, "which combined with the existing fraud complaint against Carter's Supply Company establishes a pattern of conduct." Briggs looked at Wyatt. "You've got yourself quite a woman here, Hale." "I know it," Wyatt said. Elena did not comment on being referred to in the third person. She was already thinking about what came next. What came next was Thomas Greer. He came to the ranch himself 2 days after Briggs sent a deputy to retrieve Voss's briefcase and issue a summons. He came alone, which surprised her. She'd expected lawyers, intermediaries, the practiced indirection of a man who didn't like to be seen doing his own difficult work. But he came alone, and he came to the front door. And when Elena opened it, he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I'd like to speak to Hale," he said. "Mr. Hale is in the barn," Elena said. "You can speak to me first." Greer looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, not contempt, not calculation, not the managed pleasantness of a man controlling a room. Something more genuine and less comfortable than any of those. "You know this doesn't end with a fraud complaint," he said. No, Elena agreed. It ends in the district court in Cheyenne, where the forged dead instrument and the Carter supply records will be entered into evidence, and where the pattern of conduct against this ranch over 4 years will be laid out for a judge to consider. She paused. That's where it ends. He was quiet for a moment. You'd have been better off going back to St. Louis. You thought so, she said. You were wrong. When Wyatt came from the barn and stood beside her in the doorway, Greer looked at the two of them together, Elena with the satchel in her hand and her chin level, Wyatt with the quiet solidity of a man standing on his own ground, and whatever calculation he had come to make, she watched him make it and arrive at a different conclusion than he'd planned. He left without another word. They stood in the doorway and watched the buggy turn back toward Millhaven, and the afternoon was cold and clear, and the Double H stretched out behind them in every direction, the barn and the bunkhouse and the corrals and the fence lines running out to the horizon, everything solid and standing and accounted for. Pete Dolan appeared from the barn with a bucket nodded at both of them, and went back to his work without comment, which was exactly what Pete Dolan always did, and exactly what made him invaluable. Somewhere inside, Clyde Marsh was tracking mud in through the kitchen door, which Elena had told him 17 times not to do. Hector Reyes had left fresh eggs on the counter that morning. The year-end accounts were half finished on the kitchen table. The partnership agreement she'd drafted with Wyatt's name and hers side by side was waiting for a notary, a legitimate one, in Millhaven on Friday. Wyatt put his arm around her shoulders. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration. Just the natural, unhurried weight of a man putting his arm around the woman standing beside him like it was something they'd been doing for years. Mine, he said quietly. Not possessive. Not a claim. The word carried something different: recognition, the particular certainty of a man who has stopped wondering and arrived. Elena leaned into the solidity of him just slightly and looked out at the land that was hers now, too, in every way that mattered. Ours, she said. Thomas Greer's case collapsed in the Cheyenne District Court. 14 weeks later, the forged instrument ruled fraudulent by the presiding judge on the basis of the notarization discrepancy. The Carter supply fraud settled in civil court for full restitution plus damages. Elena Brooks, by then, Elena Hale, in the records of Millhaven's county courthouse, sat in the gallery with her husband's hand in hers and listened to the judge read the decision in the flat. Certain voice of a man closing a door for good. She had come to Wyoming with one trunk and one travel bag and a letter from a stranger who'd turned out not to be worth the paper it was written on. She had stayed because she had nowhere to go, and then because the work needed doing, and then because she had looked at a man across a kitchen table and understood that the ground under her feet was real. Some women spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen. Elena Brooks chose first, chose the work, chose the fight, chose to stay, and in choosing made herself impossible to leave behind. The Double H stood for another 40 years. The water in the North Pasture creeks ran clear through drought and winter and every season between. And on the east-facing window of the upstairs corner room, the morning light came in the same way it always had. Steady, unhurried, certain falling across the desk, where Elena Hale kept her accounts and her letters, and the small leather notebook where she wrote down the things worth remembering. She had a great many things worth remembering. She wrote them all down.